Okay, so we're going to talk about form painting. But before we talk about form painting, I think it's important to understand first the difference between shape and form. So, for example, circle is to shape as sphere is to form. And usually, what I tell my students when explaining before we get to form painting is to understand the basic shape. So, here we have a triangle, a square, a rectangle, and a sphere. And when we break them into their 3D equivalents, being the forms, we have two kinds of pyramids and a cone, and then we have a cube, you have a rectangular cube, and then you have a cylinder, and then the sphere. Okay, so in order to understand form, it's usually a little easier to go via using something monochromatic and then showing examples of drawings, because it's a little bit easier to understand when you're looking at monochromatic examples. You're not being confused by color or temperature, things like that. And so it's also useful to show students examples of where form painting is occurring prior to doing a demonstration, which will be something that I'll do later on in this video. So in order to understand what we have, I showed you a prior example of a circle, which is a shape, and then here we have a sphere. And we have to deconstruct what is happening. What is it that's giving the illusion of form? And it's a couple of things. One of the things is value. So if you see this example, you have values listed 1 through 9. So you have 1 listed as highlight, and then 2 as the light, middle, and the dark middle tones, and then you have a couple of halftones. It doesn't necessarily matter how that you have 9. You can definitely get away with having 5, 6, or 7. Certainly, there's examples with Sargent where he has compressed values. You see about 4 or 5. But here, what you basically have, a lot of things evade students right off the bat. This seems a little bit too complicated. And what you really have, what's really occurring, if you were to draw what's actually occurring, and if you were to draw a cross section of this, and this is what I find helpful for students, and it helps them see. If you were to subdivide these into sections and sort of isolate them as they become darker, what you're actually putting into practice is a value scale. So here we have the highlights and then progressively becoming darker. Now, I'm not saying that the value scale is exactly in this order, because you obviously have your core shadow, right? That's also known as the terminator. And that oftentimes can be your darkest value. But essentially, when students are asking, why do we have to do value scales? I don't understand. They don't understand because no one has explained that the application is going to be used in creating form. So here we have this cross section with 9 values, and then learning how to apply it. So if you were to apply this straight across, let's say that this is the cast shadow, and then somewhere between these two values is going to be your core shadow, then this is more or less how you create the illusion of form. It's also very helpful to see it in examples. A person who does this really well is Peter Paul Rubens, because he has a tendency to exaggerate a little bit of the core shadow, also known as the form shadow, also known as the terminator. And it's important to know some of these terms, especially the term form shadow, because it follows the form, right? So as you can see, the contour right? You see that shadow following this form, and you can see the contour basically mimicking the shape. And you see he does it everywhere. He's doing it here. He does it on the nose. He does it on the side of the head. And even in small amounts, as long as you have a relative number of values being expressed, the moment you add that terminator or the core shadow, you are starting to express the illusion of form. And so I think Rubens is one of the best examples because he has a tendency to make the form shadow a little bit darker. So another example, which I think looking at drawings is a really good example to understand form. Here we have Michelangelo's drawing, and as you can see, very similar in fashion to Rubens, where you have the organization of values. And so one of the things to look at, and it really is not just identifying where values are placed, but also having a mindset where you're shifting from something where you're just drawing shapes in a flat manner, and then actually thinking in terms of what is form. That is a very important transition to make. Often, when you're able to identify form, it sort of triggers this way of being able to see form over and over and over again, and then having the opportunity of organizing your values in a way that makes the illusion. So here we have obviously a very nice, beautiful outline, and then here again is the placement of the form or the core shadow, right? So you sort of have this breaking up into 3 sections, but he does this over and over again. Here it is again. Here it is in a much more subtle way because there's obviously a little bit more light raking across this form, and then you automatically get the feeling and the illusion that this form is much larger and this one's a little bit flatter. The other thing to keep in mind is when you start thinking about form and really trying to evaluate what is form, is it's useful to think of things in terms of topography. So this is created by a series of peaks and valleys, right? And then as it's turning toward the light, obviously you're going to have an area where there's a highlight. And most often when you see examples by Rubens or Van Dyck or Michelangelo, you'll see that when you see the core shadow, usually the highlight is not too far behind. So here we have a few examples where that's true, and then it turns quickly. When you see them close together, that means that the form is either larger or the form is turning in a quicker fashion, where here you can see that the distance between the highlight and your shadow before it turns away from the light, you get this broader section which conveys to us that this is a slightly flatter, wider area. Whereas when you see the highlight here and then your form shadow, that means that the form is turning much more quickly away from the light source. Let's look at another example by Van Dyck. And Van Dyck, obviously a former student of Rubens, who paints in a very similar fashion. If we take a look, I mean, this painting is full of form painting. If you take a look at the placement of the highlight, a nice distribution of the middle value, and then this time it's just a sliver of form shadow. So that conveys something different than this means that the topography is much steeper because it's moving at a really quick rate. It also means that the light source is coming from the left area. Now, if we look at the way that he's painted the horse, same thing. He's very aware of the placement and the distribution of the middle values, the highlights, and then the core shadow. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, you'll be able to get the full effect. So here we have core shadow, also known as form shadow, core, right? So it's being distributed in a way that creates the illusion of volume in the same way that you get the impact with Michelangelo, these forms, these peaks and valleys. Okay, so what you're about to watch is a sped up demonstration executed in oil, monochromatic. This is about 20 minutes of painting, sped up to about, I want to say, 2.5 minutes. So here we have the distribution of values, and in the beginning, you probably saw the drawing, and what I'm doing is trying to distribute the values in a way that still conveys the basic forms, meaning the nose is made up of basically 3 spheres, and the bridge is made up of a 3-faceted rectangle. So here I'm painting the sphere to give comparison of where the values are and how the values are distributed onto the nose. And so I'm kind of going back and forth between these two and sort of adjusting my values. And the arrow is sort of giving you an idea of what direction the light is coming from. Here I'm sort of giving context to the nose. So here I'm breaking down the values. We have the highlight, a light value, a middle value, the coarse shadow, and a reflected light. So I have broke it down to 5 values, and of course the more values you have, the more realistic the effect you're going to achieve. So if you're able to achieve 7 to 9 values, you're going to be in the hyper-realist or photorealist realm. Certainly with 5 values, you'll get enough realism. It won't be photorealist, but it will be realistic. So here I'm breaking it down into very, very simplified means 3 spheres, and then the bridge of the nose being a box. As you can see, and even a really quick and crude method, you get the effect of form.